Hello. Is this on? Okay. Welcome to the SES SGA event for the spring semester. We are proud to welcome Dr. Edward Feser. Feser, right? Not Feser. To SES. Dr. Feser is going to be speaking on the relationship or the ideas of classical theism versus theistic personalism. Dr. Feser is Catholic. He is a Thomist. He finds common ground with us on many of these issues. He's an associate professor at Pasadena City College. He teaches classes under the issues of metaphysics, philosophy of mind, philosophy of nature, teleology. He's very well written on many of these subjects. He's got books and articles out in plenty number. He's married with 6 kids, and I want you to welcome Dr. Edward Feser.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Everybody can hear me okay? And there was a handout prepared for the talk, which I trust was available out front. Does everybody have a copy of that? All right. I noticed they gave me 2 waters, so I thought I would do the Garth Brooks thing, you know, with the... Never mind. Okay. All right, well, it's not only an honor to be invited to speak here at Southern Evangelical Seminary, but it's also personally gratifying insofar as Professor Norman Geisler played an important role in my becoming a philosopher. First time I ever witnessed a high-level exchange of philosophical and theological ideas was at a debate between Professor Geisler and the process theologian John Cobb at the Claremont School of Theology in California in the late 1980s. The fact that rigorous argumentation could be given for theological claims made a great impression on me. In that sense, I suppose you might say that Professor Geisler was one of my first teachers. And in case you're wondering, yes, Professor Geisler won that debate. My topic today is the nature of God as that is understood within the classical theist tradition. And I'll also say something about how that understanding differs from what Brian Davis calls the theistic personalist conception of God, which Professor Geisler has also aptly labeled the neo-theist conception of God. Classical theism is represented by such thinkers as Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, a trio that I well remember Professor Geisler citing prominently at that debate back in the 1980s. Theistic personalism, or neo-theism, is represented by prominent contemporary philosophers of religion like Alvin Plantinga and Richard Swinburne. To a first approximation, the difference between the views is this. For the theistic personalist, the way to start working out the nature of God is to begin with the idea that God is a kind of person like us, but without our limitations. The classical theist, by contrast, holds that the way to start is instead by thinking of God as the ultimate reality, and in particular, the ultimate explanation of why anything exists at all. These different starting points lead the 2 views to very different end results. To be sure, both views do affirm some of the same divine attributes, including personal attributes such as intellect and will. But they understand these attributes in very different ways, and the theistic personalist ends up with a conception of God which, in the view of classical theists, is too anthropomorphic and inadvertently blurs the distinction between the creator and the created, between the creator and the creature. It will be useful for the purposes of this evening's talk for you to have a sense of exactly how the classical theist takes God to be the ultimate explanation of why anything exists. So let me begin by briefly summarizing a couple of representative arguments, namely what I call the Aristotelian proof of God's existence and the Thomistic proof of God's existence. These are arguments that I develop and defend at length in my recent book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. But again, for present purposes, I will give you just a quick summary. And here we move into the heart of this first section on the handout there, the introductory material here. The Aristotelian proof begins from the fact that change occurs and argues that what change involves is the actualization of a potential. For example, when an ice cube melts, the potential that the frozen water has to be in a liquid state is actualized. The proof then proceeds to argue that a potential can be actualized only by what is already actual. For example, the warmth of the air around the ice cube is already actual, and so it can actualize the potential liquidity of the water. By the same token, if what is doing the actualizing is itself going from potential to actual, then it will require some other already actual thing to actualize it. Hence, the air around the ice cube might be warm only because a central heating unit is keeping it warm. Thus do we have a series of actualizers of potential. Potential is actualized by something already actual, but that something is itself actual only because some third thing is actualizing it, and so on. So that's the first stage of the argument. And then the next stage of this proof is to draw a distinction between a linear series of actualizers and a hierarchical series of actualizers. A linear series extends forward and backward in time. For example, the ice cube is melted by the warmth of the surrounding air. The air is now warm because the central heating unit had earlier been switched on. The unit was switched on because you'd earlier started to feel cold, and so forth. The members of a hierarchical series, by contrast, all exist simultaneously at the same moment of time. For example, the ice cube exists here and now only because the potential of its atoms to constitute water molecules specifically, rather than some other kind of molecule, is actualized here and now. The atoms, in turn, exist here and now only because the potential of these subatomic particles to constitute atoms is actualized here and now, and so forth. Now, hierarchical series are metaphysically more fundamental than linear series because a thing first has to exist at any given moment in time in order to manifest any changes over time. Now, the Aristotelian proof argues that a hierarchical series of actualizers must of metaphysical necessity terminate in a first member. For each member of such a series has actualizing power only in a derivative or borrowed way, and nothing can have derivative or borrowed power without something to derive or borrow it from. The ice is actual here and now only because its atoms constitute water molecules here and now. And that is true only because the subatomic particles constitute those atoms here and now. One level of reality is actualized by another only because that other is in turn being actualized here and now by yet another. Now, the only thing that can terminate this regress is something that can actualize without itself having to be actualized. And that would be something which is, as it were, already fully or purely actual. So there must be, here and now, and at any moment at which we're considering the question, a purely actual actualizer, which is what ultimately actualizes the existence of the ice cube, or if anything else we might start our inquiry with. And this idea of a purely actual actualizer is the core of the Aristotelian proof's conception of God, from which everything else follows. So that, stated in a very compressed way, is the Aristotelian proof. It gives you a sense of the way in which a classical theist might argue for God. So now let me briefly summarize the Thomistic proof, one other example of such an argument. The Thomistic proof, named of course for Thomas Aquinas, and Thomism is the school of thought deriving from Thomas Aquinas, begins with a distinction between the essence and the existence of a thing. The essence of a thing is what it is, where its existence is the fact that it is. So suppose a child has never before heard of a lion or a Tyrannosaurus Rex or a unicorn, and I give him a complete description of the nature or essence of each of them. Then I tell him that of these three animals, one exists today, one used to exist but has gone extinct, and one never existed. I ask him if he can tell me which is which on the basis of the knowledge he now has of the essences of each of them. Of course, he would be unable to do so, which illustrates the point that the existence of a thing, if it does in fact exist, is something distinct from and additional to its essence. This is what's sometimes called Aquinas' knowledge argument for the distinction between essence and existence. You can know the essence of a thing completely without knowing one way or the other whether it exists. So its existence is some additional factor. Now, the Thomistic proof then proceeds to argue that anything whose essence or nature is distinct from its existence must have existence imparted to it from outside by something that already exists. And this is true at any moment at which it exists, and not merely at the moment in the past when it was first generated. For example, for the ice cube that I spoke of earlier to exist here and now, there must be something imparting existence to it here and now, because its essence is here and now distinct from its existence. But if what is imparting existence to it here and now is itself something whose essence is distinct from its existence, then it too requires something to impart existence to it here and now. As with the Aristotelian proof, what we have here is a hierarchical series, and as with the Aristotelian proof, the series cannot go on to infinity because each member described so far has only borrowed or derivative causal power. The existence of the ice cube here and now is imparted to it by some other thing, which is also here and now having existence imparted to it. And if the series continues in this way ad infinitum, we will just keep passing the metaphysical buck and never arrive at an actual explanation of the ice cube's existence. The only thing that can end this regress is something in which there is no distinction between its essence and its existence, something whose very essence just is existence, what Aquinas calls subsistent being itself. And so the ice cube, or anything else with which we begin our inquiry, can exist here and now only if, either directly or indirectly, it has existence imparted to it here and now by a cause which is subsistent being itself. This is the core of the Thomistic proof's conception of God, from which everything else we say about God follows. Now, on analysis, it turns out that anything that is subsistent being itself would have to be purely actual, and anything that is purely actual would have to be subsistent being itself. In other words, the Aristotelian proof, which reasons to the existence of a purely actual cause, and the Thomistic proof, which reasons to the existence of a cause which is subsistent being itself, each arrive at the existence of one and the same divine first cause by different routes. Indeed, monotheism follows from the idea that God's essence and existence are identical and that he is purely actual, because in order for there to be more than one instance or member of a kind or class of things, there must be a distinction in each member between its essence and its existence, and between the ways in which it is actual and the ways in which it is potential. For example, though they have the same canine essence in common, Fido and Rover can be distinct from one another because this essence is embodied in two different bits of matter, the matter that makes up Fido's body and the matter that makes up Rover's body. In general, matter is what differentiates different individual members of any class of physical things. That's Aquinas' position anyway. But being material entails having potentiality. For example, material things are always changeable in various ways, and changeability entails potentiality. You can't change unless you've got some potential that goes on to be actualized. So if something is purely actual and lacks any potentiality, then it cannot be material, and in that case, you cannot distinguish one purely actual thing from another in the way that you can distinguish one physical thing from another. Or consider angels, which are not physical things. Gabriel and Michael share the same angelic essence, but they can nevertheless be distinct angels because the existence of Gabriel is distinct from the existence of Michael. For Aquinas, this essence-existence distinction is what makes it possible for there to be more than one instance or member of a kind or class of immaterial things. But if in something there is no distinction between its essence and its existence, if its essence just is its existence, then there is no way to distinguish different instances or examples of this kind of thing. In short, without an actuality-potentiality distinction in God or an essence-existence distinction in God, there is no way, even in principle, for there to be more than one thing that has the divine nature. Hence, there cannot be more than one God. Okay, and to foreshadow what I'm going to say in a few minutes, this is one reason why divine simplicity is so important. You couldn't have monotheism in principle unless you have divine simplicity. Because if you deny divine simplicity, you're saying there is in God both actuality and potentiality, or there's both essence and existence. They're distinct, and you lose the deep philosophical grounds for why there can be only in principle one God. Okay, but I'm getting ahead of myself, so I'm going to come back to that. Now, this is all very compressed, of course, I realize, but again, I'm here merely summarizing lines of argument that I develop in considerable detail in my book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. What I will be talking about this evening is the nature of this unique divine first cause and of his relationship to the world, as this is understood within classical theism. The topic is a very large one, and in 5 Proofs, I devote a chapter of about 80 pages to it, essentially a small book within the larger book. Naturally, I cannot here cover all the ground that I cover there, so I'll focus on just a few key issues. In particular, I will talk about the doctrine of divine simplicity and about God's omnipotence and omniscience, his being all-powerful and all-knowing, and about the doctrines of divine conservation and concurrence, which have to do with the way God relates to the world. However, investigating the nature of God and of his relationship to the world requires the application of 3 general philosophical principles, 3 general background philosophical principles. So let me first say a little bit about those. And this brings us to section 2 of the talk as outlined on the handout you've got before you. Okay, so the first of these background principles that I want to say a little bit about is known as the principle of proportionate causality, or PPC for short, which states that whatever is in an effect must be in its cause, insofar as a cause cannot give what it doesn't first have to give. To be more precise, the principle holds that whatever is in an effect must be in its total cause in some way or other, whether formally, virtually, or eminently, to use Aquinas' jargon. A simple example will illustrate the idea. Suppose that I give you a $20 bill. Your having it is the effect. One way in which I could cause you to have it, I'm the cause together with some other factors, I'm the cause of it. One way in which I could cause you to have that effect is by virtue of having a $20 bill in my wallet and handing it to you. That's the most obvious way. In that case, I have the form or fit the pattern of possessing a $20 bill, and I cause you to have the same form. That would be a case of what is in the effect being in the cause in what Aquinas calls a formal way. It's in the effect as in the cause in the same way it's in the effect. That's the most obvious sort of example. But it might be that I don't have a $20 bill on hand ready to give you, but I do have at least $20 in the bank, and I can wire the money from my account to yours so that you can withdraw it from an ATM. In that case, what is in the effect was in the total cause, me plus my bank account, etc., virtually rather than formally. So in that case, I don't have the $20 on me actually, but I have it virtually insofar as I can get it on demand, or I can wire it to you and you can get it on demand. So that's a second way in which what's in the cause, what's in the effect is first in the cause. Or, third possibility, it might be that I do not have even $20 in my bank account, but I do somehow have access to a Federal Reserve Bank printing press and can get a genuine $20 bill printed off for you on demand. In that case, what is in the effect is in the total cause, me plus the printing press, etc., eminently, as Aquinas puts, in an eminent way or in a higher way. For while in this case, I don't have an actual $20 bill or even $20 in the bank, I would have something even more fundamental, causally speaking, namely the power to make $20 bills. And they'd be real $20 bills because they came off an actual government printing press. Now, I defend this principle at some length, the principle of proportionate causality in the book. It follows straight away from the principle, straightforwardly, from the principle of causality and the principle of sufficient reason, both of which I also defend at length in the book. If there were some aspect of an effect that didn't come from its total cause, then that would involve a potentiality that was actualized without anything doing the actualizing. And that would violate what's known as the principle of causality. Nothing can go from potential to actual unless there's something already actual that makes that happen. Or if there could be something in the effect that was not in the cause, then it would be an aspect of the effect that lacked an explanation, which would violate the principle of sufficient reason, which tells us that for anything that exists, any fact about it, there's an explanation of why it's that way rather than some other way. Again, I say a lot more about all that in the book, but for present purposes, suffice it to note that what I have to say about the nature of God and his relationship to the world presupposes this principle of proportionate causality, hence my discussion of it. All right. Now I turn to the second background principle, agere sequitur esse. A second key background principle is what Aquinas and other scholastic philosophers call the thesis, agere sequitur esse, which is Latin for action follows being. The basic idea here is that what a thing does necessarily reflects what it is. Eyes and ears function differently because they are structured differently. Plants take in nutrients, grow and reproduce, while stones do none of these things because the former are living things and the latter are inanimate, and so forth. The thesis that action follows being can be understood as an application in the context of what Aristotelian philosophers call formal causes, of the basic idea that the principle of proportionate causality expresses with respect to efficient causes. An efficient cause is what brings about the existence of something or a change in something. The principle of proportionate causality tells us, again, as we've just seen, that whatever is in the thing that changes or comes to exist in some way must in some way have been in the total set of factors that brought about this change or existent. In this sense, the effect cannot go beyond the cause. A formal cause, as distinct from an efficient cause, is the nature of a thing, that which makes it the kind of thing that it is. For example, being a rational animal is the nature of a human being, for Aristotle and Aquinas. The characteristic attributes and activities of a thing flow or follow from its nature, as, for instance, the use of language flows from our nature as rational animals. The principle agere sequitur esse, or action follows being, basically says that these attributes and activities cannot go beyond that nature any more than an effect can go beyond its efficient cause. Hence, a stone cannot exhibit attributes and activities like nutrition, growth, and reproduction because these go beyond the nature of a stone. Anything that could do these things just wouldn't be a stone in the first place. The principle that action follows being, like the principle of proportionate causality, follows from the principle of sufficient reason. If an effect could go beyond its total efficient cause, then the part of the effect that went beyond it would have no explanation and be unintelligible. And similarly, if a thing's activities could go beyond its nature, if, for example, a stone could take in nutrients or use language, then this activity would lack an explanation and be unintelligible. So I say more about this principle as well in the book, but for present purposes, suffice it to note that this is a second principle agere sequitur esse, or action follows being, that I'm going to presuppose in the argumentation that follows. And then the third background principle presupposed in what follows is Aquinas' notion of the analogical use of terms, as opposed to what he calls the univocal and equivocal uses of terms. When I say that Fido is a dog and Rover is a dog, I'm using the term dog univocally, or in the same sense. When I say there was a bat flying around the attic and I swung the bat at it, I'm using the term bat equivocally, or in completely different and unrelated senses. There's no connection at all between a baseball bat and the bat that flies around your attic. The analogical use of terms is an intermediate kind of usage. So when I say that this wine is still good and George is a good man, I'm not using the term good in exactly the same sense, since the goodness of wine is a very different thing from the goodness of a man. But the two uses are not utterly different and unrelated either, as they are in the bat example. The goodness of the one is analogous to that of the other, even if it is not exactly the same thing. When we speak of the being or reality of different kinds of thing, we are once again using terms in an analogical way. For example, consider a substance and its attributes, such as a stone on the one hand, and the color and shape of the stone on the other, its attributes. Both the stone on the one hand and its color and shape on the other are real, but the reality of the latter is not the same as that of the former. The color, shape, and other attributes exist only in the stone which has them, whereas the stone itself does not exist in the same sense in another thing. Attributes modify and depend on substances in a way that substances don't modify or depend on anything else. But neither is the reality of a substance and that of its attributes totally unrelated either. It is not as if substances are real and attributes are unreal, the way that something that is a bat in the sense of a stick used in baseball is a non-bat in the sense of a flying mammal. Hence, they have being and reality, substance and attributes have being and reality, not in either univocal or equivocal senses, but in analogical senses. There's something in the attributes that's analogous to the being. There's a kind of being or reality in the attributes that's analogous to the being or reality of a substance, even though it's not the same thing exactly. Now, when we predicate various attributes to God, power, knowledge, goodness, and so on, we need to understand those terms too in an analogical rather than univocal way. This is a key doctrine in Aquinas. We are, for Aquinas and other Thomists, saying that there is in God something analogous to what we call power in created things, something analogous to what we call goodness in us, and so forth. Note that we aren't saying that God is only metaphorically powerful, good, and so forth. Analogical language of the sort that I'm talking about here is literal, not metaphorical. A man and a bottle of wine are both literally good, and a substance and its attributes are both literally real. But the terms are nevertheless not being used in a univocal way, not in a strictly identical sense. So analogy in the sense in question here is not the same thing as metaphor. It's a kind of literal usage. Now, the topic of analogy as well is a lot more complicated than anything I've said here so far lets on. And once again, it's something that I say a lot more about in my book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. The point for present purposes is just to note that Aquinas' thesis that theological language should be understood in an analogical way is a third principle that will be presupposed in what follows. Okay, so now we turn to section 3 on the handout. With these background ideas in place, the principle of proportionate causality, agere sequitur esse, or action follows being, and the analogy of being, let's turn to the question of what we can deduce concerning the nature of the God whose existence is established by arguments like the Aristotelian and Thomistic proofs that I summarized earlier. What are the attributes of God? What can we know about him beyond his being the cause of the world, etc.? Let's begin with the doctrine of divine simplicity, according to which God is absolutely simple in the sense that he is in no way composed of parts of any kind, whether physical parts or metaphysical parts. And as those of you who've taught divine simplicity know, there's nothing harder to understand than divine simplicity, okay? Paradoxical as that sounds. The basic argument for divine simplicity, however, is that whatever has parts requires a cause, something distinct from it that accounts for the parts being combined. Hence, since God is the ultimate uncaused cause of things, he must be simple or without parts. The basic idea is a fairly straightforward idea, but understanding it requires some elucidation. Now, it cannot be emphasized too strongly that the unity of God, the oneness of God, is inseparable from his simplicity, as I mentioned earlier. If there were in God a distinction between his essence and his existence, or between actuality and potentiality, then there could, at least in principle, be more than one God. God's status as first cause is also inseparable from his simplicity. So again, I summarized very briefly earlier the key arguments for monotheism, why there cannot be in principle more than one God. The idea is if you deny simplicity, if you affirm that there's both actuality and potentiality in God, for example, or a distinction in God between his essence and his existence, he has parts in at least that sense, you basically undermine the possibility of giving a philosophical demonstration of monotheism. God would be unique only at best in practice and not in principle. So that's one key reason why simplicity is so important. But again, God's status as first cause is also inseparable from his simplicity. If there were in God a distinction between actuality and potentiality, or between his essence and his existence, or any other parts at all, then again, he would, like everything else, require a cause of his own, something that accounts for how those parts happen to be combined so that he can exist. Hence, to deny that God is simple or non-composite is implicitly to deny his uniqueness and his ultimacy. Insofar as such a denial makes of God a mere instance of a genus, it reduces him to the status of a member of a pantheon of gods. And it does so even if we think of him as the unique member. After all, the nature of a Zeus or an Odin would not change, even if they became the sole occupants of Olympus and Asgard, respectively. David Bentley Hart, and this might be in his book, The Experience of God, he's got a great label for this idea, this denial of divine simplicity and the sorts of implications that would have that I'm describing here. He says the view amounts to, denying divine simplicity amounts to a kind of monopolytheism, right? So God turns out to be the sole member of a class which could in principle have had multiple members. And if that's all God is, if he happens to be what just happens to be the unique member, then we're not really talking about God anymore. We're essentially talking about a creature. Now, insofar as such a denial makes of God yet one further thing in need of a cause, it reduces him to the level of a creature, and it does so even if we think of him as somehow the one creature who happens to lack a cause. Into the bargain, allowing that there could be some composite thing which lacked a cause would also undermine the very arguments that got us to God in the first place, certainly arguments of the sort that I rehearsed earlier. Neither would any of this change, even if we continue to insist that God is immaterial and incorporeal, as Zeus, Odin, and the creatures familiar to us in everyday experience are not. We would still have reduced God to what is, in essence, nothing more than a kind of super angel. Worshipping him would therefore constitute a kind of idolatry. Indeed, to deny that there is anything simple or non-composite would entail atheism because it implicitly denies that there is really anything having the ultimacy definitive of God. So for reasons like these, and I hope I've sufficiently painted the stakes as very high indeed, for reasons such as these, the mainstream of the Western tradition in philosophical theology, whether in the thought of pagans like Aristotle and Plotinus, Jews like Maimonides, Muslims like Avicenna and Averroes, or Christians like Athanasius, Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, the tradition has always insisted on divine simplicity as a non-negotiable element of any sound conception of God. The Catholic Church, too, has insisted on it as a key component of basic orthodoxy, teaching it as binding doctrine at the Fourth Lateran Council and the First Vatican Council. It is also affirmed by Protestant thinkers such as Luther and Calvin. The doctrine of divine simplicity has accordingly come to be regarded as the core of classical theism. Nevertheless, there has in recent decades been resistance to the doctrine from, of all people, certain theologians and philosophers of a broadly theistic bent. These writers have been characterized as neo-theists and theistic personalists, as I noted earlier, to distinguish them from the classical theist tradition against which they are reacting. The view is called Theistic Personalism because it essentially treats God as the unique member of a species falling under the genus person, alongside other species of persons like human beings and angels, and differing from them in lacking their limitations in power, knowledge, goodness, etc. Note that what distinguishes neo-theism or theistic personalism from classical theism is not that it regards God as personal as opposed to impersonal. That's not the issue. Since most classical theists attribute intellect and will to God, they too generally regard God as personal. Rather, what sets the views apart is that theistic personalists regard God's being personal as entailing that he falls under a genus, and that in this and other ways he is not simple or non-composite. Here I'm alluding to some other background metaphysical themes in Aquinas that I haven't really talked about, but the idea is that in things other than God, we can distinguish between their genus, the general category they fall under, and what differentiates them from other things in their genus. In the case of human beings, we're rational animals, so our genus, the general category we fall under, is animals, and then what differentiates us from other animals is that we have rationality. So rationality and animality, that's our essence, that's our nature, but that's got parts. That's why we need a cause. There needs to be an explanation of how rationality and animality come together in us. So if you attribute anything like that to God, you're basically making of God a kind of creature. And so even if you put God in the genus persons, and you say he's differentiated from other persons in that he's an uncaused person or something, you're attributing parts to God, you're making of him something that itself requires a cause and is not unique. Okay. Again, I'm truncating a lot of philosophy here and putting it into a few sentences, but that's the basic idea. Now, Alvin Plantinga is one prominent neo-theist or theistic personalist critic of the doctrine of divine simplicity. Commenting on Aquinas' defense of the doctrine, Plantinga claims that the doctrine holds that, quote, God is identical with each of his properties, which entails that each of his properties is identical with each of his properties, so that God has but one property, unquote. That's Plantinga on divine simplicity. But this, Plantinga complains, quotes, quote, seems flatly incompatible with the obvious fact that God has several properties, such as power and mercifulness, and also entails absurdly that God is a property and therefore that God is merely an abstract object. Okay, that's Plantinga's critique in a nutshell. But unfortunately, Plantinga very badly misunderstands the doctrine because he interprets it in light of a metaphysics of his own that Aquinas and other defenders of divine simplicity would regard as completely wrong-headed. First of all, Plantinga applies the term property extremely broadly to almost anything that we might predicate of something. For example, we say that Socrates was human, that he was wise, that he walked around barefoot, that he was married to Xanthippe, that he was Plato's teacher, and so forth. Hence, for Plantinga, being human, being wise, being barefoot, being married to Xanthippe, and being Plato's teacher are all properties of Socrates, as Plantinga uses that term. Indeed, being Socrates is a property of Socrates, as Plantinga uses that term. And among a thing's properties is its nature or essence, as Plantinga sees things. Now, this is to use this term property in an extremely broad way that no Thomist would ever countenance. It has implications for how Plantinga misunderstands divine simplicity, as we're going to see in a moment. Second, Plantinga speaks of these properties as if they existed in a Platonic third realm of abstract objects, like the forms for which, for Plato, concrete individual things participate in or exemplify. Third, Plantinga interprets predications of properties to God and to created things in a univocal way, not in an analogical way, but in a univocal way, as having the same meaning, the same sense. So when we say that Socrates is wise and that God is wise, the word wise in Plantinga's view is to be understood in the same sense in each case. Now, given these assumptions, it's no surprise that the doctrine of divine simplicity seems highly problematic to Plantinga. Power and knowledge, for example, are distinct things in us. Hence, if God has power and knowledge in exactly the same sense that we do, how could his power and knowledge also fail to be distinct, contrary to the doctrine of divine simplicity? If God is identical to his power, and power is a property in Plantinga's sense, then how could God fail to be a property himself? And if properties are Platonic abstract objects, then how could God fail to be an abstract object? You can see how Plantinga draws all these conclusions based on his background assumptions. However, Aquinas and most other classical theists would reject each of Plantinga's metaphysical assumptions. First of all, and as we've seen, when we predicate knowledge or power to God, we are, for most classical theists, not using the terms knowledge and power in the same sense as when we predicate knowledge or power to human beings or to other created things. Rather, we are saying that there is in God something analogous to what we call knowledge in us, and something analogous to what we call power in us. Hence, though what we call knowledge and power in us are certainly distinct, it doesn't follow that we call knowledge and power in God must be distinct, because the latter are not exactly the same as the former, even if they are related. To be sure, Plantinga does briefly discuss the idea that language about God is to be understood analogically rather than univocally, but unfortunately he badly misunderstands that claim as well. For one thing, he characterizes Aquinas' view as the thesis that, quote, our language about God is analogical rather than literal, unquote. That's Plantinga's gloss on Aquinas. But as I emphasized earlier, the analogical uses of language in question in Aquinas' account are literal uses of language, not metaphorical. Non-univocal does not entail non-literal. For another thing, Plantinga supposes that the analogical use of language is intended as a way to understand the claim that God is a, quote, property, and he finds that claim implausible, even so understood. But neither Aquinas nor any other classical theist would say that God is a property in the first place, whether the word property is understood univocally or analogically. The thesis is simply a straw man of Plantinga's own devising, so that his inability to find a plausible way of reading it is neither here nor there. That brings us to a second point, which is that Aquinas and other classical theists simply would not accept Plantinga's assumptions about what an essence is or what a property is. For one thing, it is simply far too crude to lump together all the various kinds of predications that we might make of a thing, indiscriminately to apply to them the same label, namely properties, the word properties, and then treat them as if they were on a metaphysical par. Rather, we need to distinguish the essence of a thing from its properties from its merely contingent accidents, its intrinsic accidents from mere relations that it bears to other things, and so on and so forth. For example, the essence of a human being is his rational animality. A capacity to find things amusing, by contrast, is not the essence or part of the essence of a human being, but is nevertheless a property of human beings, in the sense that it is proper to human beings to be able to find things amusing, insofar as this capacity flows or follows from their being rational animals. Having a certain skin color, however, is not in this sense a property of human beings, because it does not flow or follow from being a rational animal. Having a certain skin color is instead a merely contingent accident of human beings, to use Aquinas' jargon. It is, however, an intrinsic accident insofar as having a certain skin color is something inherent in a human being himself, rather than merely a matter of his being related to something else in a certain way. Socrates, being the teacher of Plato, however, is merely a matter of his bearing a certain relation to something distinct from him, rather than being something intrinsic to him. So Plantinga just rides roughshod over all that complexity. You don't have to follow everything I just said, but just to note that Aquinas and other Thomists draw a number of distinctions that Plantinga simply ignores and collapses together under the one-word properties. For another thing, as Aquinas and many other classical theists understand them, the essence of a thing, its properties, and its intrinsic accidents, contingent and otherwise, are not entities external to it. In particular, they are not abstract Platonic forms which the thing instantiates or in which it participates, to use the Platonic jargon. Rather, they are concrete, intrinsic constituents of the thing itself. For example, Socrates' rational animality is a constituent of Socrates himself, as is his property of being capable of finding things amusing and his contingent accident of having a certain skin color. Now, since Plantinga tends to assimilate these very different aspects of a thing under the single blanket label properties, in his sense of the word property rather than Aquinas' sense, and treats these properties as if they were Platonic abstract objects, his interpretation of the doctrine of divine simplicity makes it sound very odd indeed. You can understand Plantinga objecting to it, given all the stuff he reads into the doctrine. For example, it sounds like the advocate of divine simplicity regards God's having created human beings as every bit as essential to God as his wisdom is, which is odd given that God could have refrained from creating Adam, but could not have failed to be wise. And it sounds like the doctrine of divine simplicity, insofar as it identifies God with his wisdom, his power, etc., is making of God an abstract object. But in fact, these odd results follow not from the doctrine of divine simplicity itself, but rather merely from the metaphysical assumptions that Plantinga has read into the doctrine, assumptions which proponents of the doctrine would reject. Plantinga also appears not to grasp what is at stake in the doctrine of divine simplicity. To be sure, he is aware that defenders of the doctrine maintain that if God were not simple or non-composite, not composed of parts, then he would depend on something external to him. But he seems to think of the dependence in question in merely Platonic terms, as a matter of God's participating in various Platonic properties. That would, for the classical theist, be bad enough, but the problem goes well beyond that. The problem, as we've seen, is that whatever is composite or non-simple is causally dependent on something else, and thus cannot be the first cause. And that what has an essence distinct from its existence cannot be unique. The rationality and animality that define human beings can in principle exist apart from one another. Hence, there must be some cause which combines them so that human beings exist. Similarly, if God's wisdom and power, say, were distinct, then there would have to be some cause which combines them so that God exists. If God were merely one existing thing which participated in the divine essence, or were a single member of a genus, then there could, at least in principle, be more than one God. Monotheism, in that case, would not be true in principle, but only as a matter of contingent fact. In both of these respects, God would lack the ultimacy that is definitive of him. That is to say, he would not really exist at all. He wouldn't be God, he wouldn't really exist at all. Rather, what would exist instead is merely a quasi-divine ersatz, a God in the sense of a very powerful, but nevertheless essentially creaturely being. But in fact, we would not be justified in saying even that sort of God exists, or at least nothing in arguments like the Aristotelian and Thomistic proofs that I summarized earlier would justify the conclusion that such a theistic personalist or neo-theist God exists. For such arguments entail that there must be a cause which is in no way a mixture of actuality and potentiality, or of essence and existence, or in any way composite. As arguments for a first cause, they are ipso facto arguments for an absolutely simple or non-composite cause. In short, classical theism and the doctrine of divine simplicity necessarily go together. To deny the one is implicitly to deny the other. Hence, again, from the classical theist point of view, to deny simplicity is implicitly to affirm atheism. But as arguments like the Aristotelian and Thomistic proofs show, atheism is false. Hence, the doctrine of divine simplicity must be true. So part of the point I want to make about divine simplicity is that the sorts of arguments that you see in a Thomas Aquinas, or in an Aristotle, or in a Plotinus, or in a St. Augustine, or the other thinkers that influenced this book I referred to of mine, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God, they not only get you to the existence of God, but they get you specifically to the existence of an absolutely simple God, a non-composite God. And if you subtract divine simplicity from that conception, you're really throwing the arguments out with it. You can't really have the one without the other. That's the basic classical theist thesis with respect to divine simplicity. Now, objections to the doctrine raised by other recent philosophers are no better than those that are leveled by Plantinga. It is sometimes claimed, for example, that divine simplicity is incompatible with the thesis that while some things are necessarily true of God, others are true only contingently. For example, it is necessarily true that God is omnipotent, but only contingently true that he created the world, since he could have refrained from creating it had he chosen to do so. But, judges Thomas Morris, philosopher of religion Thomas Morris, quote, there seems to be no other good way to capture this truth than to say that God has both necessary or essential and contingent properties. And since a necessary property cannot also be a contingent property, it would follow that not all of God's properties can be identical. That's Morris's argument. Now, leave aside the point already emphasized that the term property is being used here in a way that Aquinas and other proponents of divine simplicity would not use it. There is another problem with this objection, as has been pointed out by the philosopher Barry Miller. Building on a distinction made by Peter Geach, Miller differentiates between real properties and what he calls mere Cambridge properties, momentarily to adopt, for ease of exposition, Plantinga's and Morris's broad sense of the term property. For example, for Socrates to grow hair is a real change in him, the acquisition by him of a real property, something that's true of Socrates himself intrinsically. But for Socrates to become shorter than Plato, not because Socrates' height has changed, but only because Plato has grown taller, is not a real change in Socrates, but what Geach called a mere Cambridge change, and therefore involves the acquisition of what Miller calls a mere Cambridge property. It's something that derives entirely from the relations of a thing to other things, and not from anything intrinsic to the thing itself. Now, the doctrine of divine simplicity does not entail that God has no contingent properties of any sort, but only that he has no contingent real properties. He can have contingent Cambridge properties, to use Geach and Miller's term. And just as Socrates being shorter than Plato is a mere Cambridge property, because it involves Plato's growing taller rather than any change in Socrates himself, so too is God's having created the world a mere Cambridge property, because it involves the world's coming into being rather than any change in God himself. Similarly, divine simplicity properly understood does not entail that all of God's properties are identical, again, using the term property in Morris's sense for the sake of argument, but it entails rather only that all of his real properties are identical. Now, omnipotence is one of God's real properties and one that he has necessarily, whereas creating the world is a mere Cambridge property and one that he has only contingently, so that, as Morris says, God's omnipotence and his having created the world cannot be identical. But this is not a problem for the doctrine of divine simplicity because it does not imply in the first place that these particular properties are identical. Okay, that I think is probably the most difficult part of the talk on divine. I promised you divine simplicity was difficult. So now we want to move on to omnipotence. Speaking of omnipotence, let's turn to that. Talking about this idea of God being all-powerful. Power is the capacity to act or to make. Now, arguments for God's existence, like the Aristotelian and Thomistic proofs, are arguments for a cause of the existence of things, and causing things to exist is a kind of acting and a kind of making. Naturally, then, there is power in God. But God does not merely have power. He is all-powerful or omnipotent. And there are several ways to see this. Consider first that anything that exists or could exist other than God would have potentials that need actualization, would have parts that need to be combined, and in essence distinct from its existence. We've also seen that such things can exist, even for an instant, only insofar as they are caused by that which is purely actual, absolutely simple, and subsistent existence itself. That's what the argument summarized earlier claimed to show. And we've also seen that there cannot, in principle, be more than one such cause. It follows then that anything that exists or could exist other than God depends at every instant on God for its existence. Recall also the principle agere sequitur esse, or action follows being, according to which a thing's attributes and activities cannot go beyond its nature. Now, when we combine this principle with the thesis that the sheer existence of anything at any moment depends on God's causing it to exist, we get the result that the operation or activity of anything at any moment also depends on God. Just as a thing can't exist for an instant without God, it can't act or do anything. It can't exert power at any instant, even for an instant, apart from God. For if a thing could not exist even for an instant apart from God, how could it act at any instant apart from God? If the thing has no independent capacity for existence, where could an independent capacity for action possibly come from? Given this principle that action follows being, the way a thing acts reflects what it is. So if it can't exist or have being apart from God, how could it act or do anything, exercise any power apart from God? Again, if the thing has no independent capacity for existence, where could an independent capacity for action possibly come from? Existing, after all, is more fundamental than acting, since it is presupposed by acting. So if a thing's essence gives it no capacity even to exist apart from God, it cannot intelligibly give it power to act apart from God. And so everything that exists or could exist other than God depends at every instant, not only for its existence, but also for its capacity to do anything on God. Nothing that exists or could exist is outside the range of his power, or has any power that did not derive from him. But to be that from which all power derives, and which has nothing outside the range of its power, is just to be all-powerful or omnipotent. Hence, God is all-powerful or omnipotent. That's one line of argument for divine omnipotence. Recall also that, of his very nature or essence, God exists in a fully actual way, as that which just is subsistent existence itself, rather than something which in any way derives existence from anything else. Factor in once again the principle that action follows being, that a thing's attributes and activities reflect what it is, and consider that to do or to make is to actualize some potential, so that to have power is to have the capacity to actualize potential. It follows from all that since God exists in the fullest possible way, he must have the capacity to act in the fullest possible way. Hence, there is no potential that he cannot actualize, and thus nothing outside the range of his power. For suppose that there was some potential that could be actualized, but that God could not actualize it. What could possibly prevent him from doing so? What could prevent him from acting in that particular possible way if he exists in the fullest possible way, given that agere sequitur esse, or action follows being? So whether we start with God's effects and work backward to his nature, or we start with his nature itself and work forward to his attributes, we arrive at the same result, namely that God is all-powerful or omnipotent. Okay, let's turn now to omniscience. As with omnipotence, so too with omniscience, or the attribute of being all-knowing, we can show that God possesses it either by working backward from his effects to the nature of their cause, or by working forward from God's nature. Again, anything that exists or could exist, and anything that something does or could do, depends at every moment on God's causal action. Now, recall the principle of proportionate causality, according to which whatever is in an effect must in some way be in its cause. It follows from these two propositions that whatever is in anything that exists or could exist must in some way be in God as their cause. So, in some way or other, colors, sounds, shapes, sizes, spatial locations, atomic structures, chemical compositions, surface reflectance properties, nutritive powers, locomotive capacities, long-windedness in a speaker, and every other feature of everything that exists or might exist, whether mineral, vegetable, animal, human, or angel, must exist in God, given the principle of proportionate causality, together with the fact that God is causing these things to exist at every moment. Now, obviously, these features cannot exist in God in the same way that they exist in all of these effects. For example, God cannot be of a certain color, shape, or chemical composition because these are all essentially features of material objects and God is immaterial. But God's immateriality is not the only reason that these features cannot exist in Him in the way that they do in other things. Even if God were material, if He merely instantiated redness and roundness, for example, if He were merely one instance or example among others of a red or round thing, then He wouldn't be the ultimate cause of all red and round things. For in that case, His own redness and roundness, being mere instances of universal forms or patterns, would themselves require explanation just as much as other instances do. And the same thing is true of any feature that angels, who are immaterial, might possess. If God merely instantiated those features just as angels do, if He was merely one instance or example of a general kind, then He couldn't be the ultimate cause of all things which have those features. Now, the Thomist would argue that redness, roundness, and other universals are real. That is to say, nominalism and conceptualism, the alternatives to realism, are false. Following Aristotle, Thomists also argue that where universals don't exist in the concrete individual things which instantiate them, the only other way they might exist is as concepts or ideas in an intellect. There is no Platonic third realm for them to be denizens of. And these are all, again, large claims, but they're also claims that I also defend at length in the book, in 5 proofs of the existence of God. So if redness, roundness, and all the other universal forms or patterns that everything that exists or might exist exhibit don't exist in God in the way in which they exist in the concrete individual things which instantiate them, then the only other way in which they can exist in Him is as concepts or ideas in an intellect. That's the only option left, given these choices that the Aristotelian would rule out. But again, they must exist in Him in some way, given the principle of proportionate causality. So it follows that they exist in Him as concepts or ideas in an intellect. And so we have to attribute intellect to God. Nor is it just concepts which exist in this intellect. Consider a cat's sitting on the mat. That the cat and the mat exist at all at any instant at which they do exist is due to God's causal activity. But that the state of affairs of the cat's being on the mat holds at any instant is also due to God's causal activity. So just as, given the principle of proportionate causality, the catness of the cat, if you will, must exist in God as the concept catness, so too must the state of affairs of the cat's being on the mat in some way exist in God. In particular, it must exist as the proposition that the cat is on the mat. For just as the concept catness is the correlate within an intellect of the universal form or pattern catness that exists in actual cats, so too the proposition that the cat is on the mat, considered as the content of a thought, is the correlate within an intellect of the state of affairs of the cat's being on the mat. Just as the concept of anything that might exist would have to be in God's intellect, so too must the propositions corresponding to any state of affairs that might obtain exist as thoughts in the divine intellect. And since these states of affairs can obtain only insofar as God causes them to. Naturally, among the states of affairs that obtain are the state of affairs that the proposition that the cat is on the mat is a true proposition, and the state of affairs that the proposition that unicorns exist is a false proposition. So thoughts corresponding to these states of affairs will also be among those that are in the divine intellect. That is to say, there is in the divine intellect the thought that it is true that the cat is on the mat, the thought that it is false that unicorns exist, and so forth. Furthermore, since everything that exists or might exist other than God, and every state of affairs that obtains or might obtain other than God's existence, depends on God's causal activity, all propositions about such things will be true or false only because God causes the world to be such that these propositions are either true or false. God is like an author who comes up with a story in a single instantaneous flash of insight. Such an author can hardly be mistaken about whether a certain character exists in the story or about whether such and such a situation involving the character occurs in the story. Nor could the author be mistaken at that instant about whether, at that instant, he has framed the story in just that way. Similarly, God can hardly be mistaken about whether he is causing such and such things to exist or such and such states of affairs to obtain, and thus can hardly be mistaken about whether such and such things really do exist or such and such states of affairs really do obtain. Now, of course, the analogy is not perfect. A human author might go on to forget some of the details of the story that he came up with. That is because the human author exists in time, transitions from one cognitive state to another, knows what he knows in part by virtue of brain processes which can malfunction, and is otherwise subject to forces outside of his control which might cause him to forget. None of those things is true of God, who is immaterial, immutable, and omnipotent. Now, on the standard philosophical account of knowledge, one knows some proposition P, whatever we plug in for P, when A, one thinks P is true, B, P really is true, and C, one thinks that P is true as a result of some reliable process of thought formation. That's a standard account, the standard analysis of what knowledge is. Now, each of these conditions, or rather, keeping in mind the doctrine of analogy, something analogous to each of these conditions, is true of God. Again, consider the proposition that the cat is on the mat. We've seen that there must be in the divine intellect the thought that it is true that the cat is on the mat, and so condition A obtains. God thinks that it's true that the cat is on the mat. That condition obtains. And it really is true that the cat is on the mat, precisely because God is causing that to be the case. So condition B obtains. You can only know something if it actually is true. And if God's causing it to occur, then it actually is true. And furthermore, there can be no more reliable way of determining whether some proposition P is true than being able to make it the case that it is true. The author in our example certainly has a reliable way of finding out whether a certain character exists in his story, insofar as he is the one who decided to put the character in the story in the first place. So since the cat is on the mat, only insofar as God himself causes it to be the case that the cat is on the mat, God certainly has a reliable way of finding out whether such a proposition is true, if you want to put it that way. And so condition C, this third condition on knowledge, that it has to arrive from a reliable process of belief formation, also obtains in God's case. And so God has knowledge. So he meets all these conditions, or something analogous to all these conditions that are generally thought to hold true of knowledge. Now, what is true of the proposition that the cat is on the mat is true also of every other proposition about what things exist or might exist, and what states of affairs obtain or might obtain. God knows all such propositions. Moreover, he can hardly have any less knowledge about himself than he has about these other things, about things other than himself, any more than an author can know less about his own creative act of coming up with a story than he knows about the story itself. Of course, a human author might not know certain other things about himself, such as what is going on at the moment in the interior of his body. But that is because the human author is composed of parts. His intellect is a distinct thing from his digestive system or circulatory system or muscles or bones or what have you. Nothing like that is true of God, who is absolutely simple or non-composite. His intellect just is his power, which just is his existence, and so forth. Now, if God has knowledge of all propositions about himself and about everything else, then he has all knowledge, and thus we can conclude that God is omniscient. Now, the analogical use of terms is crucial to properly understanding God's knowledge. I've spoken of various concepts and propositions existing in the divine intellect, but they cannot exist there in exactly the same sense in which they exist in our intellects. For in our intellects, they exist as distinct thoughts, and there cannot be any such distinctions in God consistent with divine simplicity. To a first approximation, we might think instead in terms of a conjunction of all propositions, and say that there is in the divine intellect something like a single thought with this one gigantic conjunctive proposition as its content. Take every proposition that there is and stick an and between them, and you got one giant conjunctive proposition. But even that cannot be quite right, because this single conjunctive proposition will itself have component parts. A better, though still imperfect, way to understand the nature of God's knowledge would be to think in terms of analogies like the following. From a beam of white light, various beams of colored light can be derived by passing it through a prism. Though the colors are not separated out until the beam reaches the prism, they are still in the white light in a unified way. Or from a lump of dough, cookies of various shapes can be derived by means of cookie cutters. Though the various cookies with their particular shapes are not separated out until the cutters are applied to the dough, they are still in the uncut dough virtually, you might say. Now, God is pure actuality, whereas each kind of created thing represents a different way in which actuality might be limited by potentiality. That is to say, each created thing is comparable to one of the different specific colors that might be derived from the white light that contains all of them, or it is like one of the many cookie shapes which might be derived from the dough which contains all of them. God's creation of the world is thus like the passing of white light through a prism or the application of the cutters to the dough. The prism draws out from the color spectrum which is contained in a unified way in the white light a particular beam of this color and a particular beam of that color. And the cutters draw out from the variety of possible cookies contained in a unified way in the lump of dough a cookie of this particular shape and a cookie of that particular shape. Similarly, we can say creation involves drawing out from the unlimited actuality that is God various limited ways of being actual. To be a stone or a tree or a dog is to be actual, but it is to be actual only as a stone or as a tree or as a dog rather than some other kind of actuality. Just as to be green is to be a color, but to be that specific color rather than, say, red or any of the other colors of the spectrum. And to be a cookie of a round shape is to be round rather than being, say, square or any of the other shapes which might have been taken from the dough. Again, the analogy is not perfect, but only meant to be suggestive. For one thing, created things are not made out of God in the way that cookies are made out of dough, since God, being devoid of potentiality, is not a kind of material which might take on different patterns. Now, just as if you knew the white light perfectly, you would know all the colors which could be derived from it, and if you knew the lump of dough perfectly, you would know all the shapes which might be carved out of it, so too, perfectly to know that which is pure actuality would entail knowing all the various limited ways of being actual which might be derived from it. And that is how God knows all the various kinds of finitely actual things which exist or might exist, by virtue of perfectly knowing himself as that which is pure or unlimited actuality. That is not to say that his knowledge is exactly like that of someone who grasps the nature of white light or of dough, but it is analogous to that. And even if the analogy is imperfect, that is only to be expected given how very far beyond its ordinary sphere of operation reason has to push itself when seeking ultimate explanations. All right, so that's omniscience. Now let me briefly say something at the end of the talk here about divine conservation and concurrence. That's the last item referred to there on the handout. So let me now say something about God's relationship to the world. The Aristotelian and Thomistic proofs, rehearsed earlier, show that nothing that is distinct from God could continue in existence even for an instant if God were not sustaining it in being. It thereby establishes what is known as the doctrine of divine conservation, according to which the world would be instantly annihilated in the absence of divine causation. Creation is not a one-time event that occurred at some distant point in the past on this view. It's occurring at every moment. This argument also thereby answers the rival thesis of what's called existential inertia, according to which at least some of the things that make up the world will, once they exist, tend to continue in existence on their own, at least until something positively acts to destroy them. Excuse me. If something has this kind of existential inertia, it is claimed, then it need not be conserved in being by God. Now, one problem with this thesis is that its proponents never explain exactly what it is about a material object or any other contingent thing that could give it this remarkable feature of existential inertia. It is merely suggested without argument that things might have existential inertia, so-called, as if this were no less plausible than the claim that they are conserved in being by God. Another problem with the thesis is that no material thing, nor any other contingent thing possibly could have such a feature. The reason is that all such things are composite. They're made up of parts, and in particular are mixtures of actuality and potentiality and of essence and existence, and anything that is composite in such ways requires a sustaining cause, as the arguments rehearsed earlier purport to show. Anyone who claims otherwise has the burden of answering arguments like the Aristotelian and Thomistic proofs. Merely suggesting that things might have existential inertia is not to answer such arguments, but simply to ignore the arguments. One moment here. The fan wants me to finish. It's blowing the pages forward. Now, though material things are at every moment dependent for their existence on God, they are distinct from God. This follows from the fact that they are composite, whereas God is simple. They're mixtures of actuality and potentiality, whereas God is pure actuality. And they have essences distinct from their existence, whereas God just is subsistent existence. The arguments I've been defending thus rule out a pantheist conception of God, which would identify him with the world. They also rule out what's called a panentheist conception of God, the conception defended by process theologians like John Cobb, whom I mentioned earlier when I referred to his debate with Professor Geisler, according to which God is not identical with the world, but is still present in the world in such a way that he is changed by it. As I argue in 5 proofs, given that God is pure actuality and absolutely simple, he must be immutable or unchanging. The world's mutable and changing, and God is immutable and unchanging. God cannot be identical with the world, and he can't even be related to it in this panentheist or process theology way. Now, these 2 theses, that things are dependent for their existence on God but are nevertheless distinct from God, when conjoined with the principle that action follows being, which I referred to earlier, yield a conception of divine causality, which is known as the doctrine of divine concurrence. This concurrentist position is perhaps most easily understood by comparison with 2 rival views, known as occasionalism on the one hand and mere conservationism on the other. Here I borrow some terminology from Fred Freddoso, professor at Notre Dame. Occasionalism holds that nothing in the created world has any causal efficacy at all, and that only God ever really causes anything to happen. For example, when you leave a glass of iced tea outside and the ice cubes melt in the sun, it is, on this view, not the sun that causes the ice to melt, according to occasionalism. Rather, it is God who causes them to melt. That he does so on the occasion that the sun is out is what makes it falsely seem that the sun is what is melting the ice. Similarly, it's not the cue ball which causes the 8 ball to go into the corner pocket. Rather, on this view, it is God who causes the 8 ball to go into the corner pocket on the occasion when the cue ball makes contact with it, and so on. The first cause, on this view, is the only cause, and nothing else has even any secondary or derivative causal power. So that's occasionalism. Mere conservationism, meanwhile, the other extreme, holds that although God keeps things in existence, he conserves them, they have their causal efficacy independently of him. God, on this view, God keeps the sun in existence, but the sun melts the ice cubes independently of God. God keeps the cue ball in existence, but the cue ball causes the 8 ball to move independently of God, and so forth. Now, concurrentism, which is Aquinas' position, rejects these 2 views and takes a middle ground position between them. Against occasionalism, it maintains that the sun, the cue ball, and all the other created things have genuine causal power. They are true causes. They really do things. Against mere conservationism, on the other hand, it maintains that created things nevertheless cannot exercise this causal power independently of God. For neither of these extreme positions can be correct given what I've been arguing earlier. Consider first why occasionalism cannot be correct. Since agere sequitur esse, that is to say, what a thing does necessarily reflects what it is, then if something could not truly do anything, if it had no causal efficacy at all, then it would not truly exist. What it does reflects what it is. If it doesn't do anything, it can't exist in any way. Occasionalism, therefore, would entail that God alone truly exists, since only he really does anything. And this cannot be right. For one thing, we know that things other than God do exist: tables, chairs, rocks, trees, and so on. Even if you were seriously to entertain the possibility that those things do not really exist after all, but were somehow mere hallucinations that you were having, you would still know that you exist, and you are not identical to God. I hate to break it to you. After all, the very fact that you're thinking through these various possibilities entails that you are changeable. You move from one thought to the next, whereas God is immutable. The fact that you would not be certain whether tables, chairs, etc. exist under this scenario would show that you are not omniscient, whereas God is omniscient, as I've argued. The fact that you lack power in various ways, for example, you could not make yourself stop experiencing tables, chairs, etc., even if you convinced yourself that they are not real, shows that you are not omnipotent, whereas God is omnipotent, and so forth. So you know that at least one thing other than God exists, namely yourself, which would not be true if occasionalism were true. For another thing, even if you could coherently deny the existence of yourself along with everything else, occasionalism would still leave us with an incoherent position in another way. For we arrived at the idea of God as first cause only because we reasoned from the existence of things other than God which require him as a cause. For example, we started with the idea that certain things are composites of essence and existence. We inferred that there must be something that causes these component parts to be combined, and we deduced in turn that the ultimate cause must be simple or non-composite. So if we now say that God alone exists, we would be abandoning the very grounds that led us to affirm the existence of God as first cause in the first place. It would be like somebody who slowly and carefully climbs a ladder, and then pulls out a ray gun and blasts it out from under him. He would fall to the ground, making his cautious ascent entirely pointless. Now consider why mere conservationism, the opposite extreme view, cannot be correct. We're almost done here. Since agere sequitur esse, again, what a thing does necessarily reflects what it is. If something could do what it does independently of God, if it had causal efficacy apart from any divine assistance, then it could exist independently of God. We would be left with an essentially deist conception of God on which, even if God is the creator of things, they might carry on without him once created. And this cannot be right. For one thing, and as we've seen, nothing other than God possibly could exist even for an instant without God's conserving action. This follows from a thing's being composite rather than simple, from its being a mixture of actuality and potentiality, and from its having an essence distinct from its existence. For another thing, the resulting position would again be incoherent. For it was the idea that things cannot exist on their own, even for an instant, that led us to the idea of God as first cause in the first place. To say that these things might exist without God after all would once again be like climbing a ladder and then blasting it out from under one. So the correct view has to be the middle ground concurrentist position according to which secondary causes are real. That is to say, things other than God have real causal power, even if they have it only in a secondary or derivative way, insofar as they derive that power from God as first or underived cause. Occasionalism denies that secondary causes are real, insofar as it says that only the first cause really causes anything. And mere conservationism denies that secondary causes are real, insofar as it says that causes other than God have their causal power independently of God, and thus do not have it in a merely derivative or secondary way. One view denies the secondary part, the other one denies the cause part of secondary causes. Secondary causes are true causes insofar as they make a real contribution to the effect. The effect would not be of precisely the character that it is if some other secondary cause were involved instead. Secondary causes are secondary insofar as they would be inert without divine assistance. God must cooperate or concur with everything they do if they are to do anything, hence the label concurrentism. To borrow an example from Fred Freddoso, to whom I alluded earlier, if you draw a square on a chalkboard with blue chalk, both you as primary cause and the chalk as secondary cause are joint causes of the effect. You, of there being any square there at all, and the chalk of the squares being blue in color. The chalk makes a real contribution to the effect insofar as the effect would have been very different if the chalk had been red, or if the writing instrument had been a pen or pencil instead of chalk, etc. But no effect at all would have been produced had you not pressed the chalk against the board. Or consider the moon, which gives light only insofar as it receives it from the sun. The moon makes a real contribution to the effect insofar as its appearance in the night sky would be very different if the soil on its surface had a different color, or if it were in other respects made of a different sort of material. But it would give no light at all if there were no sunlight for it to reflect. God's concurrence with the secondary causes that he conserves in existence is analogous to your relationship to the chalk or the sun's relationship to the moon. Now, among the secondary causes with which God must concur if they are to have any efficacy are human beings. Does this entail that we lack free will? Short answer is no. To borrow an example from David Oderberg, consider a father teaching his young son how to write letters by guiding the child's hand. The child who does not yet know how to write an A, for example, will not be able to do so unless he allows his father to guide his hand in the right direction. The child could resist his father's guidance and move his hand in the wrong direction, or he could submit to that guidance and allow it to be moved in the right direction. There's nothing in the father's guidance per se that rules out either possibility. Hence, the child's free choice of whether to resist or submit makes a real contribution to the effect. All the same, the effect, the letter A appearing on the page, will not occur without the father's guidance. God's concurrence with our free actions is analogous to that. And I sense God ceasing to concur with my action of continuing with this lecture, so I think at this point I will cease. Thank you very much for your attention.